as you encounter a piece of information, what you want to be thinking constantly is this piece of information accurate? And so you're going to start with things like, well, who exactly is putting it out there and why are they putting it out there, right? You're going to think about what process generated that piece of information, which are the journalistic norms that we discussed, which are the normal practices in the way that people tend to produce information. But you're also going to want to think as well about whether some error in the process led to whatever it is. So a recent example was when President Trump first moved into the White House, a statue or a bust of Martin Luther King was moved within the Oval Office. There was a reporter who didn't notice that and published a story, thinking he was accurate, that that bust had been removed from the Oval Office. It happened to be an inaccurate piece of reporting. He corrected it not very long thereafter. But nobody else reported that. That was a major credible outlet, and it was fixed pretty quickly. And so if you wanted to discover that particular story was in error, you could look at the fact that there was a correction on it. You could Google the story and see if others had reported the same thing or if that hadn't been reported by other outlets. You could try to see whether there was sort of confirmation across different sources. And in particular, what you want to look for is, do multiple high-quality sources seem to endorse the same story? Do they seem to have found sources or their own sources that are saying the same thing, right? So if you've got a bunch of different outlets that are citing a particular thing that happened, and those outlets are credible outlets themselves, that's a pretty good endorsement for the story. Now, one of the big differences you're going to run into is that some publications are going to put a particular story on page 1, and some are going to put it on page 22, right? At least in the newspaper context. And you can think of that in the modern era as on the front page of their website, or where you have to drill down through the politics section and four links away. But if something's an important news story, it's not likely to be entirely missed by every major news organization. Sometimes it happens, but most of the time what happens is some of those organizations will decide, well, it's a little less important, and some will decide it's more important. If there's nobody else reporting on something, that should be a red flag, right? So Google it. Figure out if other people are reporting on it. If nobody is right now, wait before sharing it. And then Google it again in a couple of hours and see if that story's either been corrected or if somebody else has reported the same thing that's also credible. And if you find that that's happening, that's good evidence that what you're sharing is indeed right. The piece of information that you're looking at is accurate, right? If you don't find that, it's not really that important that something gets shared immediately. It's a lot more important that it's right. And so trying to find a way to prevent yourself from passing on pieces of information or convincing yourself of something before somebody else has reported it is a good practice. So as we talked about earlier, the headline is not necessarily the be-all, end-all of an article. In fact, it again is often written by other people. And what that means is that if you're looking at a particular story, you want to know not what the editor decided the story says, but what the story actually says. So don't stop there. Don't stop at paragraph 1. Read the thing. If you're going to share it, make sure that you know what you're sharing. Make sure that you know what you're believing. And make sure that you at least pay attention to whatever sources in the thing are arguing against the conclusion you're making. Because if you don't do that, you haven't even given the information justice as a piece of reporting. And you also aren't doing your job as somebody evaluating it to figure out, is this thing really credible? Or is it part of a story but not really there yet? So in addition to thinking about the different cognitive biases that people can have when encountering a piece of information, we also are subject to a whole bunch of logical fallacies, both in how we think about information and how we argue for it. And trying to recognize some of those different logical fallacies can be important to preventing ourselves from being conned or from actually making misleading arguments. My wife encountered a really interesting case not that long ago where somebody had pointed her to a particular section of the Affordable Care Act that was, at least in that person's view, evidence that the government was going to put RFID chips in various individuals. It turns out if you went and looked at the bill, if you didn't know the medical terminology, you might actually come to that conclusion. So what this friend of hers had found was a link to a news story. They followed the link to the news story, and the news story had said, well, in the Affordable Care Act, at this particular section, there is language about this that means that they're going to put RFID chips in people, right? And so that conspiracy theory spread throughout the internet. If you haven't noticed yet, we don't all have RFID chips through Obamacare. And the reason is because that's not actually what the provision was about. The provision was about tracking implantable medical devices that people use. And so my wife actually happens to be a type 1 diabetic. And type 1 diabetics are infamous for the sheer number of implantable medical devices that they often end up using, right? And it's a good thing to do aftermarket tracking of implantable medical devices. But if you don't know what that means, you might come away with the wrong conclusion. It's a case where a slight inaccurate piece of information ended up exploding into something much larger based on a bunch of assumptions that people ended up making, right? And they didn't, in many cases, go back to the original or try to understand what the original medical language meant to be able to discern what was really going on. And so that rumor spread, even though thinking about it logically, it didn't really make a lot of sense. If your goal as a consumer of information is to be somebody who tries to do the best job they can figuring out what's right and what's wrong, which is what your goal really should be if you want to be a good democratic citizen, if you want to be somebody who's an effective deliberator, and if you want to be somebody who can help really persuade others effectively, then what you need to do is you need to successfully counter your own biases, recognize where it is that you may have been led astray or that you might lead others astray, and pay attention to where the information you're looking at really seriously comes from. And where that information comes from is not necessarily just the story you end up thinking about or what you end up linking to. It's also, quite frequently, where they got their information from, what it is that they're trying to do with the information, and how that information is packaged as it reaches you. And those key elements provide the core of what you should be looking for as you try to figure out whether a particular piece of information is credible, and subsequently, whether it's worth passing on to others, or you should wait.